I boarded the Penitent Star seeking redemption. 20 years in the Imperial Guard, countless battles, mountains of corpses wearing the faces of brothers I had abandoned to save myself. The guilt was a wound that would not heal, festering in my soul like gangrene. So I sold everything, spent my life savings on passage to Ophelia Seven, where the Shrine of Saint Aspira promised absolution to the truly penitent. I found no redemption aboard that ship, only darkness, madness, and the truth that faith is the Imperium's cruelest weapon. Trust nothing in the void, especially salvation. My name is Matthias Kane, and I was a dead man long before I boarded that cursed vessel. Not dead in body, but in spirit, hollowed out. A shell that moved through the manufactorums of opus metallum, performing the same repetitive tasks day after day, year after year, while the past ate at me from the inside like a cancer that no Medicae could treat. I had served the Emperor faithfully for 2 decades in the Astra Militarum. The Vandarian Rifles, 15th Regiment, 4th Company. We were good soldiers, competent, disciplined, unremarkable in the vast machinery of the Imperial Guard. We fought on a dozen worlds whose names I can barely remember now. Compliance actions against rebellious governors, Xenos extermination campaigns on frontier worlds. The endless, grinding warfare that is humanity's lot in the 41st millennium. But it was Hadrian's Veil that broke me. That broke all of us, though I was the only one left alive to carry the breaking forward into the years that followed. We were garrison troops on Hadrian's Veil, a civilized world in the Calixis sector. Beautiful, by Imperial standards. Green forests, clean water, cities that rose toward the sky rather than burrowing into the earth like the hives I had known in my youth. Our regiment was stationed there as a show of force after some minor unrest among the agricultural workers. It was supposed to be easy duty, rest and resupply before our next deployment. The Dark Eldar came without warning. That is their way, of course. They live for the terror of the unexpected strike, the sudden transition from safety to nightmare. One moment I was standing watch at the perimeter of our encampment, bored and tired. The next, the sky was filled with their ships, sleek and wrong in ways that hurt to look at. Their warriors descended in a storm of blades and exotic weapons that cut through our defenses like they were nothing. We fought. Emperor knows we fought, but we were not prepared for an enemy like that. They moved too fast, struck from impossible angles, laughed as they butchered us. Within an hour, my entire company was being systematically dismantled. Not killed quickly, as one might show mercy to worthy opponents. No. The Dark Eldar harvested us, took men alive, screaming. Their bodies opened and altered in ways that should not be possible. I survived because I was a coward. When the line broke and our captain was taken, when the screaming became so thick in the air that it was like breathing liquid horror, I ran. I found a drainage culvert filled with the bodies of my brothers who had already fallen. I buried myself among them, smearing their blood across my face and uniform, playing dead while the Xenos monsters walked above me, selecting victims for their sport. I lay there for 6 hours. 6 hours listening to the screams of men I had trained with, fought beside, called brothers. I could have emerged, could have died with them, fighting as a soldier should. Instead, I remained motionless among the corpses, breathing shallowly, praying silently to the Emperor for deliverance I had not earned. When the Dark Eldar finally departed, satiated on suffering, I was the only survivor of 4th Company, 140 men reduced to 1. Me, the coward who had hidden while his brothers died. The subsequent investigation cleared me of wrongdoing. I had survived, and survival is not a crime in the Imperial Guard, no matter how it is achieved. I was reassigned to a new regiment, served out the remainder of my term, and received an honorable discharge. On parchment, in official records, I was a veteran who had earned his rest through faithful service. But I knew the truth. I was a deserter in spirit, if not in letter. I had abandoned my duty, in the moment it mattered most. The nightmares began almost immediately after Hadrian's Veil. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that culvert, feeling the weight of dead men pressing down on me, their blood cold on my skin, their empty eyes staring at nothing. I could hear Captain Verson calling for me, shouting my name as the Dark Eldar dragged him toward their ships. In the dreams, I would try to move, to answer, to help, but my body would not respond. I was paralyzed, a coward frozen by fear. I woke screaming most nights. The Hab unit neighbors complained. Eventually, I was moved to a single occupancy dwelling in the lower levels of the Manufactorum complex, where my screams would disturb fewer people. This was considered accommodation for a veteran's needs. The Imperium is generous in such small ways. Work became my only anchor to reality. I operated heavy machinery in the Manufactorum, massive presses that shaped raw metal into components for Imperial vehicles. The work was dangerous, required constant attention, and left me exhausted. This was good. When I was exhausted enough, sometimes I could sleep without dreaming. Sometimes, but the guilt never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. I would see families in the market districts, children playing, and I would think of the men who had died on Hadrian's Veil, men with families of their own, men who had fought while I hid. What right did I have to live when they had perished? What right did I have to the simple pleasures of existence, food, sleep, the warmth of sunlight when they were gone? I considered suicide more than once. It would have been just, in a way, an admission of guilt, a sentence self-imposed and carried out. But I was too much of a coward even for that. Suicide is a mortal sin in the Imperial Creed, one that condemns the soul to oblivion rather than return to the Emperor's light. I could not face eternity knowing I had failed twice, first in life, then in death. So I turned to faith. Not the casual, perfunctory faith of most Imperial citizens who recite prayers because it is expected, who attend Mass because failure to do so draws suspicion. No, I sought something deeper. True faith, the kind that might burn away guilt, like fire purges infection. I began attending services at the local shrine daily rather than weekly. I memorized the prayers of contrition, the litanies of sacrifice, the hymns of the fallen. I flagellated myself in private, the pain, a small penance for my great sin. I donated what little money I earned beyond basic subsistence to the shrine, hoping that perhaps the Emperor would see my devotion and grant me some measure of peace. It was during one of these services, 3 years after my discharge from the Guard, that I first heard of the Penitent Star. The preacher that day was a visiting missionary from the ecclesiarchy, a woman named Sister Helena who had traveled across the sector spreading the word of the Emperor's mercy. She spoke of pilgrimage, of the ancient tradition of faithful citizens traveling to holy worlds to seek blessings, perform penance, and draw closer to the God Emperor. She spoke specifically of Ophelia Seven, one of the cardinal worlds, second only to Holy Terra itself in spiritual significance. On Ophelia Seven stood the Shrine of Saint Aspira, a martyred saint who had given her life to save an entire hive city from demonic corruption. It was said that those who made pilgrimage to her shrine with true contrition in their hearts could find forgiveness for even the gravest sins. That the saint herself, from her place at the Emperor's side, would intercede on behalf of the penitent. The words struck me like a physical blow. Here, at last, was a path forward, a way to earn the redemption I so desperately sought. If I could make pilgrimage to Ophelia Seven, if I could kneel before Saint Aspira's shrine and truly repent, perhaps the Emperor would grant me peace. Perhaps I could finally silence the voices of my dead brothers that echoed in my mind. After the service, I approached Sister Helena. I explained my situation, though I could not bring myself to share the full depth of my cowardice. I told her I was a veteran seeking absolution for the horrors I had witnessed and the brothers I could not save. It was truth enough. She regarded me with eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the soul beneath. Then she smiled, a gentle expression that carried both pity and hope. "The Emperor provides for those who seek him with sincere hearts," she said. "There is a pilgrimage ship, the Penitent Star, that travels to Ophelia 7. It departs from the orbital station in 4 months. Passage is not cheap, but for one such as you, it may be worth any price." I asked about the cost. She named a figure that represented nearly everything I had saved over my years of work. Passage in Penitent class, the lowest tier, the bare minimum required to board. I would have to sell almost all my possessions, live on minimal subsistence for the next 4 months to save the remainder. It would leave me destitute. But what did that matter? I had no family, no ties, nothing binding me to this world. If I returned from Ophelia 7 with my soul cleansed, I could begin again. And if I did not return, at least I would have tried. I agreed immediately. The next 4 months passed in a haze of preparation and anticipation. I sold everything that was not essential furniture, clothes beyond a single change, the few personal items I had accumulated. I worked double shifts at the manufactorum, volunteering for the most dangerous tasks because they paid better. I ate only corpse starch rations, the cheapest form of nutrition available. Every throne I could spare went into the account that would purchase my passage to salvation. I learned what I could about the Penitent Star. It was a merchant vessel repurposed for pilgrimage runs, owned by a Chartist captain and chartered through the ecclesiarchy for this sacred purpose. The ship made the journey to Ophelia 7 twice each standard year, carrying thousands of faithful pilgrims seeking blessings or performing penance. The journey would take approximately 6 months through the warp, a significant undertaking but nothing unusual for interstellar travel in the Imperium. The propaganda pics I saw were glorious. The Penitent Star was depicted as a magnificent vessel, its hull adorned with Gothic architecture and covered in prayer scrolls. The interior was shown filled with chapels and meditation chambers, places where pilgrims could deepen their faith during the long voyage. The crew were described as faithful servants of the ecclesiarchy, dedicated to ensuring pilgrims reached their destination safely and spiritually prepared for the sacred experience ahead. I believed every word. I wanted to believe, needed to believe that this journey would provide what I sought. When the day of departure finally arrived, I made my way to the orbital station with the few possessions I had retained. A single bag containing 2 sets of clothes, my discharge papers from the guard, a small icon of the Emperor that had belonged to my mother, and the documentation proving I had purchased passage aboard the Penitent Star. The orbital station was chaos incarnate. Thousands of pilgrims had gathered from across Opus Metallum and neighboring worlds, all seeking passage on this voyage. The crowds were overwhelming, a sea of desperate humanity pressing toward the processing stations. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap incense, and the recycled atmosphere that all orbital stations shared. I joined the masses, waiting in line for 16 hours before reaching the processing station. There, a board functionary checked my documentation, stamped my passage permit, and directed me toward the embarkation gate without ever making eye contact. I was cargo to be loaded, nothing more. As I walked toward the gate, I caught my first glimpse of the Penitent Star through the observation ports. It was massive, easily several kilometers long, a great vessel of metal and stone that dwarfed even the largest ships I had seen during my guard service. Its hull was indeed covered in Gothic architecture, towering spires, statuary of saints and angels, prayer scrolls etched into the metal in letters 3 meters tall. It was beautiful in the way that Imperial architecture is beautiful. Imposing, overwhelming, designed to make the individual feel small and insignificant before the majesty of the God Emperor. I felt hope then, genuine hope. For the first time since Hadrian's Veil, this ship would carry me to redemption. This ship would deliver me from the guilt that had consumed me. I would kneel before Saint Aspira's shrine. and I would be forgiven. I boarded the Penitent Star with faith in my heart and salvation in my thoughts. I was a fool, but I could not have known. Not then. The Imperium teaches us that faith is a shield against the darkness, that the Emperor protects those who believe, that righteousness and devotion are rewarded. How could I have known that faith itself would be the weapon used against me? That the desperation of the faithful makes them perfect victims. The embarkation ramp was steep, crowded, guarded by armed ship security who watched us with the cold detachment of men moving livestock. We were herded forward in groups of 50, each group directed to different sections of the ship. My group was directed downward, always downward, through corridors that grew progressively narrower and more cramped the deeper we descended into the vessel's bowels. The architecture changed as we moved away from the boarding areas. The grand Gothic design, the prayer scrolls and statuary, all of that remained on the upper levels. Down here, where Penitent class would be housed, the walls were bare metal, poorly lit, stained with rust and the accumulated grime of decades. The air grew thicker, warmer, less pleasant to breathe. Pipes hissed overhead, leaking steam that made visibility poor and the heat oppressive. We arrived finally at Penitent Dormitory 7, one of dozens of massive chambers that would house the lowest class passengers. The space was vast, perhaps 200 meters long and half as wide, but it was packed with bunks stacked 4 high and arranged in tight rows that left barely enough room to walk between them. Each bunk was a simple metal shelf with a thin mattress, a single blanket, and nothing else. No privacy curtains, no storage compartments, no amenities of any kind. There were already hundreds of people in the dormitory when we arrived, and more groups were being led in behind us. I claimed a bunk on the 3rd level of a stack near the back wall, using what remained of my guard instincts to find a position that was defensible if necessary. Even here, even aboard a ship supposedly devoted to holy pilgrimage, I could not fully trust my surroundings. As I settled onto my bunk, I looked around at my fellow pilgrims. They were a diverse group, as one might expect from a vessel drawing passengers from across multiple worlds. I saw elderly men and women, their bodies bent with age and hardship, seeking one final blessing before death. Young families with children, hoping to secure divine favor for their offspring. Middle-aged workers like myself, worn down by decades of labor and seeking something beyond the daily grind of existence. And scattered among the obviously faithful were those who carried a different quality, the desperate, the criminal. Those seeking not redemption but escape. It occurred to me then, in that crowded dormitory filled with the smell of too many people in too small a space, that I had no idea who any of these people truly were. We were strangers united only by our desire to reach Ophelia Seven and whatever we hoped to find there. For 6 months, we would live in this space, eat together, pray together, exist in forced intimacy. Yet we were all fundamentally alone, each carrying our own burdens, seeking our own salvation. I lay on my bunk and closed my eyes, exhaustion from the long journey to the orbital station finally catching up with me. Around me, the sounds of thousands of pilgrims settling in created a constant low hum of noise conversations, crying children, coughing, praying. This would be my home for the next half year. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw the faces of my dead brothers from Hadrian's Vale. I whispered a prayer, asking the Emperor to grant me the strength to complete this journey, asking Saint Aspira to intercede on my behalf, asking for redemption I knew I did not deserve, but desperately needed. The Penitent Star was scheduled to depart in 6 hours. Soon we would enter the warp and begin the long voyage to Ophelia Seven. Soon, I told myself, I would find peace. I was so very, very wrong. The Penitent Star translated into the warp 6 hours after I boarded, though I did not witness the transition directly. We were deep in the ship's bowels, far from any observation ports, and the Geller field activation felt like nothing more than a subtle change in air pressure and a momentary disorientation that passed quickly. One moment we were in real space. The next we were traveling through the Imperium, that impossible realm where the laws of physics bend and break, where demons swim through thought made manifest. I had traveled through the warp before during my guard service, and the experience had never been pleasant. Even with Geller fields protecting us from direct exposure to the warp's madness, there was always a wrongness to warp travel, a sense that reality was thinner, that if you looked too closely at shadows, they might look back. Most soldiers dealt with it by staying busy, following routine, not thinking too deeply about what lay beyond the ship's protective barriers. Here on the Penitent Star, the wrongness was amplified by our conditions. Within hours of departure, the true nature of Penitent-class passage became apparent. The ship's structure was divided into strict hierarchical classes, and the divisions were absolute. At the top were the High Pilgrims, wealthy, faithful, who had paid enormous sums for private quarters, personal servants, and access to the ship's finest chapels and facilities. I never saw that section of the ship, but rumors filtered down through the crew. Cushioned furniture, real food, spaces clean and well-maintained. Below them were the standard pilgrims, middle-class faithful who had paid significantly more than I had for semi-private dormitories, decent rations, and regular access to prayer services in the ship's larger chapels. They at least retained some dignity in their journey. Then there was us, penitent class, the lowest of the low. We were housed in the ship's deepest levels, as far from the light and air as possible, while still being technically habitable. Our section of the vessel was adjacent to the engine compartments, and the constant vibration and heat from those massive machines made sleep difficult and comfort impossible. The walls sweated condensation constantly, and the metal floors were always slick with moisture that collected in puddles when the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated. We numbered approximately 3,000 souls in Penitent class alone. 3,000 desperate people crammed into dormitories and corridors designed to hold perhaps half that number comfortably. Privacy was a memory. Personal space was a luxury that did not exist. We lived on top of each other, our lives pressed together in forced intimacy that bred both camaraderie and resentment in equal measure. The daily routine was established within the first week and never varied. We were awakened each morning at 0500 hours by a blaring klaxon that echoed through the dormitories like the scream of a dying animal. We had 30 minutes to relieve ourselves in the communal facilities, massive rooms lined with latrines that offered no privacy whatsoever, where you performed your bodily functions shoulder to shoulder with strangers while trying to maintain some shred of dignity. At 0530, we were herded to the feeding halls for morning meal. The food was corpse starch rations, that ubiquitous imperial staple made from recycled organic matter. The rations were formed into gray blocks that tasted of nothing and everything simultaneously, a flavor that was somehow both bland and actively unpleasant. We received 1 block per person, supplemented with a cup of recycled water that had been purified so many times it seemed to have forgotten it had ever been anything else. From 0600 to 1400 hours, we were required to attend mandatory prayer sessions. 8 hours of continuous devotion, conducted in massive assembly halls where thousands of us knelt on hard metal floors, while ecclesiarchy priests led us in prayers, hymns, and sermons. The priests rotated throughout the day, but their messages were consistent. We were sinners seeking redemption. Our suffering was purification. Our discomfort was necessary penance. The Emperor demanded our complete devotion. Sister Carmilla oversaw penitent class prayer sessions. She was a severe woman, tall and gaunt, her face a study in harsh angles and disapproving lines. Her robes were the deep crimson of the ecclesiarchy, decorated with symbols of martyrdom and sacrifice. She carried a power maul that crackled with energy, and she was not hesitant to use it on pilgrims who showed insufficient devotion. I witnessed her strike an elderly man who had dozed off during prayer, the blow sending him sprawling across the floor. She stood over him and declared in a voice that echoed through the assembly hall, Sleep is weakness. Weakness is sin. Sin demands penance. The old man struggled back to his knees, blood running from a gash on his forehead, and resumed his prayers with renewed fervor. No one helped him. We had learned quickly that showing compassion could mark you as insufficiently devoted, which would draw Sister Carmilla's attention. Better to keep your head down, recite your prayers, and survive. After prayer sessions ended at 1400 hours, we were assigned to work details. The ship required constant maintenance, and Penitent class provided free labor for the more menial tasks. Some cleaned the corridors, scrubbing away the accumulated filth that gathered in the lower levels. Others worked in the waste reclamation systems, processing the ship's sewage and refuse. I was assigned to the cargo holds, moving supplies and equipment under the supervision of the ship's crew. The crew were distinct from both the pilgrims and the ecclesiarchy priests. They wore the uniforms of a Chartist captain's private service, dull gray jumpsuits marked with the ship's insignia, a stylized star surrounded by prayer scrolls. They treated us with the casual contempt that the employed show to the desperate, ordering us about like servitors, never using names, only pointing and shouting when our work was too slow or too careless. Work details lasted until 1800 hours, at which point we were fed again another corpse starch block, another cup of water, and then given 2 hours of free time before mandatory evening prayers at 2000 hours. Free time was a joke. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do except return to the dormitories and try to find some small measure of rest before the evening devotions began. Evening prayers lasted 2 hours, shorter than the morning sessions but no less intense. Then, at 2200 hours, we were released to our bunks for 6 hours of sleep before the cycle began again. This was our existence. Every day, identical to the last. No variation, no respite, no mercy. We were told this routine was designed to purify us through discipline and devotion, to prepare our souls for the sacred experience of reaching Ophelia Seven. In truth, I think it was designed to break us, to reduce us to mindless automatons who would accept anything, endure anything, without question. Among the 3,000 souls in Penitent class, I began to recognize faces, to form tentative connections with those who occupied the bunks near mine. Relationships formed not out of choice but out of proximity and shared misery. The bunk below mine was occupied by a man named Jove. He was younger than me by perhaps a decade, lean and scarred, with the hard eyes of someone who had survived through cunning rather than strength. He told me, during one of our brief conversations in the rare moments of privacy, that he had been a ganger in the underhive of his homeworld, part of a brutal organization that controlled territory through violence and intimidation. He had fled after a gang war went badly, leaving dozens dead and him marked for execution by his enemies. The pilgrimage was his escape, a way to disappear into the masses and hopefully find a new life on Ophelia Seven. I did not judge him. Who was I to judge anyone's past when I carried my own sins so heavily? At least Jove was honest about what he was. He made no pretense of deep faith or spiritual seeking. He was a survivor, and he approached the pilgrimage with the same calculating pragmatism he had brought to gang warfare. "This place is wrong," he told me one night, during the brief window between evening prayers and lights out. His voice was barely a whisper, conscious that others might overhear and report us to Sister Carmilla. "I've seen a lot of bad things, Matthias, done a lot of bad things, but there's something about this ship that doesn't sit right. The way they watch us, the way they count us during every assembly, it feels less like a pilgrimage and more like inventory." I had noticed it too, though I had not wanted to acknowledge it. The crew's attitude toward us was not the respectful concern one might expect toward pilgrims undertaking a sacred journey. It was the clinical efficiency of stockyard workers managing livestock. We were assets to be tracked and maintained, nothing more. Across the narrow aisle from my bunk was a family, the Harkins. Davin Harkin was a manufactorum worker like myself, his hands scarred and calloused from decades of labor. His wife, Melia, was thin and worn, her face etched with worry lines that spoke of years of hardship. They had a daughter, Elise, 8 years old, with large dark eyes and a smile that appeared rarely, but lit up the gloom when it did. Elise was dying, some wasting disease that the family could not afford to treat through normal Medicaid channels. They had spent everything on this pilgrimage, gambling their entire future on the hope that Saint Aspira's intercession might provide a miracle cure. Watching them was like observing my own desperation reflected back at me. They had the same desperate hope I carried, the same faith that if they just endured enough, sacrificed enough, traveled far enough, salvation would be granted. Little Elise bore her illness with remarkable strength. She was often too weak to attend the mandatory prayer sessions, and Sister Carmilla had granted her an exemption after Davin pleaded on his knees, offering to perform extra work details to compensate. During the hours when I returned from my work assignments, I would sometimes see Elise sitting on her bunk, carefully drawing pictures on scraps of parchment her mother had saved. She drew the Emperor, or her imagination's version of him, a golden giant with kind eyes, surrounded by angels. She drew Saint Aspira as a beautiful woman with wings, holding sick children in her arms. "She'll be healed when we reach Ophelia Seven," Melia told me once, her voice carrying the forced certainty of someone trying to convince herself as much as others. "The saint will see her faith, and the Emperor will provide." I nodded and smiled, offering hollow reassurance. What else could I do? Tell her that faith was no guarantee of anything? That the galaxy was vast and uncaring, that millions died every day regardless of their devotion? I kept my doubts to myself and hoped, for their sake, that they were right. There was another pilgrim who drew my attention, though for different reasons. Brother Sebastian occupied a bunk in the far corner of our dormitory, as far from others as the cramped space allowed. He was old, perhaps 70 or 80 standard years, his body bent with age, and his face a weathered landscape of wrinkles and scars. His eyes were the most striking thing about him, pale blue, almost colorless, and they held a depth of knowledge and sorrow that made me deeply uncomfortable whenever they fixed on me. Brother Sebastian rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. He had made this pilgrimage before, he claimed. Multiple times, in fact. He spoke of Ophelia Seven with the familiarity of someone who knew it well, describing the Shrine of Saint Aspira in detail, recounting the procedures pilgrims would follow upon arrival. This should have been comforting, having an experienced traveler among us. Instead, it was disturbing, because whenever Sebastian spoke of the journey itself, the time aboard ship, his descriptions were vague, his eyes distant, and his hands would shake slightly as if recalling something he wished he could forget. He pulled me aside one evening during the brief free time between work detail and evening prayers. His grip on my arm was surprisingly strong for someone so aged, and his pale eyes bored into mine with unsettling intensity. "Watch the upper decks," he whispered, his breath smelling of corpse starch and tooth decay. "Listen for the screaming. Count the pilgrims in your dormitory every night. Note who is missing." I tried to pull away, uncomfortable with the contact and the cryptic warning. "What are you talking about? What screaming?" "They never tell you the truth about these ships," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "The pilgrimage is real. Ophelia Seven is real. But the journey is where they harvest, where they select. Some of us reach the destination, many do not, and those who disappear are never spoken of again." He released my arm and shuffled away before I could press him for details, leaving me standing in the corridor with his words echoing in my mind. I told myself he was senile, paranoid, his mind damaged by age, or perhaps by too much exposure to the warp's insidious influence. The warp could do that. I knew drive people slowly mad over time, especially those who traveled through it frequently. But his words lodged in my brain like a splinter, impossible to ignore completely. The first month aboard the Penitent Star passed in grinding monotony. The routine never varied. Wake, relieve yourself. Eat, pray. Work, eat, pray. Each day bled into the next until time became meaningless. We had no access to chronometers beyond the ship's daily cycle, no windows through which to observe our progress, no information about our location or estimated arrival time. We existed in a bubble of controlled ignorance, told only what the crew and priests deemed necessary for us to know. But small things began to feel wrong. Little inconsistencies that accumulated into a growing sense of unease. The food rations were reduced after 3 weeks, not dramatically, but noticeably. Our corpse starch blocks became slightly smaller. The explanation, when Sister Carmilla announced it during morning prayers, was brief and brooking no argument. Minor delays in our journey require conservation of resources. This is a small sacrifice compared to the glory that awaits at journey's end. Accept it with gratitude for the opportunity to practice restraint. The pilgrims accepted this, as we accepted everything else, because we had no choice. But I noticed that the crew's rations did not seem diminished. When I worked cargo details, I saw them eating what looked like actual food protein bars. Preserved fruits, things that bore no resemblance to the gray blocks we choked down daily. Then there were the announcements. Roughly once per week, a voxcast would echo through penitent class, always during evening prayers, when we were all gathered and could be addressed simultaneously. The messages were delivered by someone identified only as Captain Voke, presumably the master of the Penitent Star, though I never saw him in person. His voice was cultured, educated, carrying the accent of someone born to privilege rather than the lower classes. He spoke of minor warp turbulence and unexpected currents that necessitated course corrections. He assured us that arrival at Ophelia 7 was still expected, though the timeline might be extended slightly beyond the original 6-month estimate. He urged us to maintain our faith and devotion, to see these small delays as opportunities for deeper spiritual preparation. 6 weeks into the journey, he announced that we should expect perhaps an additional month of travel. 7 months total, rather than 6. At 8 weeks, the estimate became 8 months. At 10 weeks, he stopped giving specific timelines entirely, saying only that we were making steady progress and would arrive when the Emperor wills it. Jove was the first to voice what many of us were thinking but afraid to say aloud. "We're not going anywhere," he said one night, his whisper barely audible over the sounds of 3,000 people trying to sleep in too small a space. "Or, if we are, they're taking the longest possible route. Think about it, Matthias. Every week they need more time. Every week there's a new excuse. How long before they admit we're just circling in the warp?" "Why would they do that?" I asked, though I had no good answer myself. What purpose would it serve? I don't know. But I know when I'm being lied to. Spent my whole life learning to read people, to know when someone's running a game. This feels like a game. We're the marks, and we don't know the con yet. I wanted to dismiss his paranoia, but I could not. Because alongside the timeline extensions, other things were beginning to happen. Disturbing things that were harder to explain away. Pilgrims were disappearing. It started subtly. One morning during assembly, I noticed an empty bunk where an elderly woman had slept. I asked others nearby what had happened to her. They shrugged, unconcerned. Perhaps she had died in the night. Perhaps she had been moved to a medical bay. Perhaps she had been granted an upgrade to better quarters as a reward for exceptional devotion. But she was gone, and no one seemed to know where or why. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention, taking Brother Sebastian's advice to count the pilgrims in our dormitory. The number was shrinking, slowly, almost imperceptibly. but definitively. We had started with approximately 350 people in Dormitory 7. After 2 months, we were down to perhaps 320, a loss of 30 people. And none of them explained. When someone disappeared, there were always explanations offered by the crew or priests, but the explanations were vague and varied. Some pilgrims had been transferred to medical facilities for treatment. Others had been moved to higher-class quarters as rewards for outstanding faith and service. Still others had succumbed to illness, and their bodies had been given proper funeral rites before being committed to the ship's corpse recyclers. But we never saw any of these people again. Not in other dormitories, not in the work details, not in the prayer assemblies. They simply vanished, erased from existence as if they had never been aboard at all. The pattern became clearer as I observed more carefully. Those who disappeared were almost always from specific groups: the elderly and frail, the seriously ill, young children, the weak, the vulnerable, those who could not work effectively, who required more resources than they contributed, who might not survive the journey regardless. When little Elise Harkin was taken, I knew with cold certainty that something was terribly wrong. It happened after 2.5 months aboard ship. Elise had been growing progressively weaker, her illness advancing despite her parents' desperate prayers. One morning, 2 crew members arrived at the Harkin family's bunk, accompanied by a figure in the white robes of a medicae. They spoke briefly with Davin and Melia, their voices too low for me to hear clearly, but I saw Melia's face crumple in relief as they explained that Elise was being taken for special medical evaluation and treatment. The ship has facilities for treating young pilgrims, the medicae explained, loud enough now that those of us nearby could hear. Your daughter's condition requires attention that cannot be provided in penitent class. She will receive proper care, and when she is stabilized, you will be informed of her progress. Davin and Melia embraced their daughter, whispering prayers and words of encouragement. Elise went with the crew members willingly, too weak to protest even if she had wanted to. She looked back once as they led her away, and I saw confusion in her large, dark eyes, but also trust. She believed she was being helped. She believed the Emperor was providing. That was the last time anyone saw Elise Harkin. For the first 3 days, Davin and Melia waited with barely contained anxiety for word of their daughter's condition. They asked every crew member who passed through penitent class. They approached Sister Carmilla during prayer sessions. They sent written requests through official channels. The responses were always the same. Your daughter is receiving appropriate care. Updates will be provided when available. Maintain your faith. After a week with no word, Davin's anxiety turned to desperation. He abandoned his work detail to search the ship's medical facilities, or attempted to. He was stopped by armed guards at the entrance to the upper levels and forcibly returned to penitent class. Sister Carmilla publicly punished him for dereliction of duty, striking him 3 times with her power maul while the assembled pilgrims watched. He endured the punishment without crying out, then asked again, through bloody lips, where his daughter was. Your daughter is in the Emperor's hands, Sister Carmilla replied coldly. As are we all. Accept his will. After 2 weeks, Melia stopped eating. She would take her corpse starch ration but merely hold it, staring at it without seeing, until eventually someone else would take it from her hands. She stopped attending prayer sessions, lying in her bunk with her face to the wall. When Sister Carmilla came to discipline her for this dereliction, Davin begged on his knees for mercy, promising to complete his wife's work details in addition to his own, to pray double hours, anything. Sister Carmilla regarded the broken man with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell. Your wife's grief is understandable but unacceptable. Faith requires trust in the Emperor's plan. If she cannot find that faith, she will be removed to quarters where she can be properly ministered to. The threat was clear enough. Davin redoubled his efforts to force Melia to participate, to maintain appearances. to survive. But I could see both of them were breaking, crushed under the weight of their daughter's disappearance and the cold indifference of every authority they appealed to. I lay in my bunk that night, listening to Melia weeping quietly, and Brother Sebastian's words echoed in my mind. They never tell you the truth about these ships. The journey is where they harvest, where they select. I did not want to believe it, did not want to accept that the pilgrimage I had sacrificed everything to undertake might be a lie, that the ship carrying us towards salvation might instead be delivering us to something far worse. But the evidence was mounting, and my God training would not let me ignore patterns that screamed of danger. I needed to know the truth, and I needed an ally who could help me find it. I dropped down from my bunk and crossed the narrow aisle to where Jove lay, staring at the ceiling with the sleepless eyes of someone whose mind would not grant him rest. "Still awake?" I whispered. "Always," he replied. "Can't sleep on these ships. Something about the warp makes my skin crawl, like there's eyes watching from just beyond sight." "I need to talk to you," I said. "About what's happening, about the disappearances." His eyes shifted to meet mine, and in them, I saw confirmation that he had been tracking the same patterns I had. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it's time we figured out exactly what kind of ship we're really on." Jove and I began our investigation the next day, though investigation is perhaps too formal a word for what we were doing. We had no authority, no resources, no ability to compel anyone to answer questions. What we had was observation, careful attention to patterns, and in Jove's case, skills honed in the underhive where survival depended on reading situations correctly and knowing when you were being played. We started by counting. Every morning during assembly, we would position ourselves where we could observe the crowds of penitent-class pilgrims gathering for prayer sessions. We noted faces, tried to remember distinguishing features, tracked who appeared and who did not. It was imperfect. 3,000 people are difficult to track individually, and we were just two men with limited time and no way to record our observations except memory, but patterns emerged. The disappearances were accelerating. In our first month aboard, perhaps 10 to 15 people had vanished from penitent class. In the second month, that number had doubled. Now, in the third month, we were losing 5 to 7 people per week. The explanations offered by crew and priests remained consistent: medical transfers, rewards for devotion, natural deaths from illness or age. But the sheer volume was becoming harder to dismiss, and the pattern of who disappeared was unmistakable. The elderly, the sick, young children, those who could not work effectively or required additional resources. It was as if someone was systematically culling the weak from our population, selecting those who represented burdens rather than assets. During work details, Jove used his particular skills to explore areas of the ship that were technically off-limits to pilgrims. He was remarkably good at appearing to belong wherever he went, at moving through spaces without drawing attention, at reading the subtle cues that indicated where guards would be stationed and when they would rotate. These were talents developed over years of criminal enterprise, and they served us well now. "There's a sealed cargo bay on deck 42, he told me one evening, his voice barely audible over the background noise of the dormitory. "Found it during my shift in waste reclamation. Supposed to be moving through that area, but there's a section that's cordoned off. Guard posted at the entrance. Not regular ship security either, these were professional, well-armed, alert. The kind of guards you post when you're protecting something valuable or hiding something you don't want found. Could be anything," I said, playing devil's advocate even though my instincts told me otherwise. Valuable cargo, restricted equipment, any number of legitimate reasons to secure an area. "Could be," Jove agreed. Except I heard sounds from inside. Moaning, whimpering, and machinery. Medical machinery, I think. The kind that hums and clicks and makes noises that sound wrong in ways you can't quite put your finger on. A chill ran through me despite the oppressive heat of the lower decks. Certain enough. I've heard people in pain before, Matthias. Done things that caused that pain, if I'm being honest. I know what suffering sounds like, and that's what I heard behind those sealed doors. I considered this information, weighing it against my own observations. The disappearances, the vague explanations, the pattern of selection that targeted the vulnerable. Brother Sebastian's cryptic warnings about harvest and selection. It was beginning to form a picture, and the picture was horrifying. I need to see for myself, I said finally. Dangerous, Jove replied. If we're caught in restricted areas, best case is punishment detail. Worst case. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Worst case. We would disappear like all the others. I spent 20 years in the Guard, I told him. Stealth operations, reconnaissance, infiltration of enemy positions. I know how to move unseen when necessary. Jove grinned, a flash of white teeth in the dimness. Then, I guess we're doing this. Tomorrow, during the afternoon work detail, I'll create a distraction, give you a window to slip away. You'll have maybe 20 minutes before your absence is noticed. Make them count. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Morning prayers seemed to last forever. Sister Carmilla's voice droning on about sacrifice and purity while my mind raced through plans and contingencies. The corpse starch ration at midday tasted even worse than usual. My anxiety turning my stomach into a churning pit of acid. By the time work detail finally arrived at 1400 hours, I was wound tight as a spring, ready to snap. My assignment that day was cargo hold maintenance on Deck 38. Jove was supposed to be in waste reclamation on Deck 41, but he had arranged a swap with another pilgrim who owed him a favor. We would both be working in adjacent areas. Close enough to coordinate. The work was mind-numbing as always. Moving containers from one section of the hold to another according to some organizational system that made sense only to the ship's quartermaster. The crew supervisor barely paid attention to us, more interested in his data slate than in ensuring we worked efficiently. We were just another set of hands, interchangeable and forgettable. Jove's distraction came at precisely 1500 hours. I heard a crash from the adjacent section, followed by shouting, something about a container of chemical supplies tipping over, contents spilling, danger of toxic exposure. The crew supervisor cursed and ran toward the commotion, along with 2 of the 3 guards who had been loosely monitoring our work area. I did not hesitate. The moment the supervisor's back was turned, I slipped through a maintenance hatch I had noted earlier and into the ship's utility corridors. These passages ran throughout the vessel, narrow spaces filled with pipes, cables, and ventilation systems that allowed crew to access the ship's infrastructure without traveling through passenger areas. They were claustrophobic, poorly lit, and exactly the kind of terrain I had trained to navigate during my guard service. I moved quickly, but quietly, following the mental map I had constructed from Jove's descriptions and my own observations. Deck 42 was 4 levels up, accessible through a vertical access shaft I found after 10 minutes of careful navigation. I climbed the ladder set into the shaft's wall, my hands finding purchase on rungs slick with condensation and machine oil. Deck 42 was quieter than the levels below. Fewer pilgrims worked here, and the areas I passed through seemed to be primarily equipment storage and mechanical systems. The air was cooler, the lighting slightly better, the architecture less oppressively cramped. This was a section of ship that served function rather than housing desperate masses. I found the sealed cargo bay exactly where Jove had described it. A heavy adamantium door marked with the ship's insignia and a warning in High Gothic, authorized personnel only. 2 guards stood outside, both wearing the gray uniforms of ship security, but with better equipment than I had seen on the regular crew. Flak armor, lasguns held with professional competence, vox beads in their ears connecting them to some command structure. These were not casual watchmen. These were soldiers. I observed them from my concealed position in the utility corridor, watching through a ventilation grate. They were alert, rotating their attention between the door they guarded and the corridor approaches, following a pattern that spoke of proper training and discipline. Getting past them without being seen would be difficult, probably impossible. But I did not need to get through the door. I needed to know what was behind it. The ventilation system that had brought me here extended throughout the ship, including into the sealed cargo bay. If I could access the right duct, I might be able to see and hear what was happening inside without directly exposing myself to the guards. I traced the pipes and conduits visible through the grate, following their paths with my eyes until I found what I was looking for. A ventilation intake that serviced the cargo bay, accessible from this utility corridor. I moved as silently as possible along the narrow passage, my body pressed against pipes that were alternately freezing cold and burning hot depending on what they carried. Sweat soaked through my rough pilgrim's tunic despite the cooler temperature on this deck. The ventilation intake was covered by a standard maintenance panel, secured with simple bolts that I could remove with my hands if I was careful. I worked slowly, conscious that any sound might carry to the guards only 20 meters away. Each bolt took minutes to loosen, my fingers cramping from the effort of maintaining pressure while turning without letting metal scrape against metal. When the panel finally came free, I set it aside with exquisite care and peered into the duct beyond. It was large enough for me to crawl through if I moved on my belly, my shoulders scraping against the sides. The metal was cold against my skin, and the space was dark enough that I had to feel my way forward more than see, my hands exploring ahead of me to ensure I would not crawl into a dead end or a vertical drop. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw light ahead. Faint, filtered through the slats of a ventilation grate, but enough to navigate toward. I inched forward until I reached the grate and could peer through into the sealed cargo bay. What I saw destroyed any remaining hope that the disappearances had innocent explanations. The cargo bay had been converted into a medical facility, but not the kind where healing took place. Surgical tables lined the space in neat rows, perhaps 20 in total, and most were occupied. The figures strapped to those tables were pilgrims. I recognized several faces from Penitent class, people who had vanished over the past weeks and they were being systematically processed. I use that word deliberately. Processed. Like raw materials in a manufactorum, converted from one form into another for some purpose I could not immediately determine. At the nearest table, I watched in horror as robed figures worked on an elderly man I remembered from my dormitory. He was unconscious or heavily sedated, his body opened with surgical precision. The robed figures, chirurgeons, I assumed, though their robes bore no Medicae insignia, were harvesting his organs with the efficient movements of long practice. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys. Each organ was removed, examined, and placed in a preservation canister if deemed suitable, or discarded into a waste receptacle if found wanting. The man's body was still alive during this process. I could see monitors displaying vital signs, mechanical ventilators forcing air into lungs that would soon be removed. They were keeping him alive while they dismantled him, ensuring the organs remained fresh and viable. At another table, a young woman I did not recognize was being subjected to a different procedure. Her skull had been opened, and chirurgeons were carefully excising portions of her brain, while other robed figures installed crude mechanical components in the empty spaces. A servitor conversion. I had seen servitors before during my guard service, lobotomized humans, converted into biological machines to perform simple, repetitive tasks. The process was brutal, stripping away everything that made a person human and leaving only a meat automaton capable of following basic programming. Further into the bay, I saw storage units filled with preserved organs, their labels indicating destination and purpose. Some were marked for black market sale. Others were designated for specific recipients, wealthy individuals willing to pay enormous sums for transplants that would extend their lives or replace failing organs. Still others were labeled for research purposes, to be delivered to Mechanicus facilities where they would be used in experiments I could only imagine. And in the corner, in specialized preservation tanks, I saw children. Small bodies floating in amniotic fluid, their chests opened, their organs already harvested. Among them was Elise Harkin, her large, dark eyes closed forever, her body nothing more than a shell now, emptied of everything that had made her a person. I wanted to vomit, wanted to scream, wanted to tear through that ventilation grate and attack the chirurgeons who were calmly mutilating human beings for profit. But I did none of those things. I remained frozen in place, watching, documenting in my mind every detail I could observe, because I knew that if I was going to stop this, I needed evidence. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. A figure entered the cargo bay through a door at the far end, and I immediately recognized him as different from the chirurgeons. He wore the robes of the Mechanicus, but they were wrong somehow. The red fabric was too dark, almost black, and the symbols embroidered on it were not the standard cogwheel of the machine god, but variations I did not recognize. Distortions, corruptions. He was more machine than man, his body augmented far beyond standard Mechanicus modifications. Multiple mechadendrites emerged from his back, each tipped with different tools, surgical instruments, data interfaces, weapons. His face was a grotesque fusion of flesh and metal, one eye replaced with a glowing red lens that whirred and clicked as it focused on different subjects. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a voxcaster that turned human speech into something cold and artificial. "Efficiency remains acceptable," he stated, addressing the chirurgeons. "Current harvest rate of 7 units per week from Penitent class is sustainable without raising undue suspicion. Continue prioritizing juvenile specimens and subjects with minimal social connections. Those with families raise complications. Harvest rate. Units." The clinical language he used to describe human beings made my blood run cold. One of the chirurgeons approached the Mechanicus figure, holding a data slate. "Genitor Magos Hex," the chirurgeon said, and I filed that name away carefully. "The quality of specimens from this voyage is lower than previous runs. Malnutrition, disease, and stress have degraded organ viability by approximately 15% compared to our last pilgrimage cycle." Magos Hex's mechadendrites twitched in what might have been irritation. "Acceptable losses. Penitent class is self-selecting for desperation rather than health. However, note this for future operations. Recommend slight improvement in rations during first month to ensure specimens remain viable longer. Cost increase will be minimal. Returns will justify investment." They were discussing human beings as livestock, as resources to be managed for optimal yield. The pilgrimage was not just a cover for their operation, it was the operation itself. The ship, the journey, the carefully cultivated desperation of the faithful. All of it designed to gather vulnerable people who could be harvested without consequence. I had heard enough, seen enough. My hands shook with rage and horror as I began backing away from the ventilation grate, retracing my path through the ductwork as quietly as possible. Every instinct screamed at me to do something immediate, to find a way to stop what was happening. But I was one man, unarmed, deep in a section of ship controlled by people who would not hesitate to kill me if they discovered what I knew. I needed to get back to Jove, needed to warn the other pilgrims, needed to find some way to stop this nightmare before anyone else disappeared into those surgical bays to be rendered down into component parts. The return journey through the utility corridors felt longer than the approach, every shadow threatening to conceal a patrol, every sound potentially an alarm raised against me. But I made it back to Deck 38 without encountering anyone, slipping back into the cargo hold through the same maintenance hatch I had exited from. Jove was there, still cleaning up the deliberately created chemical spill, the crew supervisor berating him for his clumsiness. When Jove's eyes met mine, I gave the slightest nod. He understood. I had found what we were looking for, and it was worse than we had feared. That evening, during the brief free time between work, detail, and evening prayers, Jove and I found a relatively private corner of the dormitory, a small alcove created by the intersection of two bulkheads where we could speak without being easily overheard. I told him everything. Described the surgical tables, the organ harvesting, the servitor conversions, the preserved bodies floating in tanks. I told him about Magos Hex and his casual discussion of harvest rates and specimen viability. I told him about Elise Harkin, her small body emptied and stored like merchandise awaiting shipment. Jove listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively harder, his jaw clenching tighter with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring at nothing, processing what I had shared. "How many people are involved?" he asked finally. "How many crew? How many chirurgeons? How many guards?" I saw perhaps 10 chirurgeons in the bay, maybe 15 guards throughout that section of the ship, but the operation is clearly larger. There must be additional facilities, more personnel. This is organized, professional, long-running. Not something a few rogue crew members could accomplish. "Captain Voke," Jove said quietly. "It goes all the way to the top. Has to. You can't run something like this without the ship's master being involved, probably profiting directly." I nodded. It made horrible sense. Pilgrimage ships operated with minimal oversight from Imperial authorities. Chartist captains held ancient rights and privileges that made them nearly autonomous. Once pilgrims boarded, they were entirely at the captain's mercy, with no legal recourse, no protection, no one to appeal to if things went wrong. "We have to tell the others," I said. "Warn people. Organize resistance." "And tell them what?" Jove countered. "That the pilgrimage they've sacrificed everything for is a lie? That the ship promising salvation is actually harvesting them for parts? Matthias, most of these people are here because they have nothing left but faith. You're asking them to abandon the last thing keeping them alive." End quote. "Would you rather they go to slaughter in ignorance?" I'm saying we need to be strategic. If we just start shouting about organ harvesting, best case is we're dismissed as mad. Worst case is Sister Carmilla decides we're spreading heresy and has us disappeared into those surgical bays you found. He was right, and I hated that he was right. We could not simply expose the truth and expect the masses of desperate pilgrims to rise up in coordinated resistance. Many would refuse to believe. Many would cling to their faith rather than accept such a fundamental betrayal. And those who did believe might panic, might act rashly, might get themselves and others killed. "Then what do you suggest?" I asked. "We gather evidence, find others who've noticed the same patterns we have. Build a core group of people we can trust, people who'll believe us, and help organize something more effective than a mob. And how long do we have? They're taking 7 people per week from Penitent class alone. How many more die while we're being careful and strategic?" Jove had no answer for that. We sat in silence, 2 men overwhelmed by the scope of what we had discovered and our own inadequacy to stop it. The next day, I went to Sister Carmilla. It was a calculated risk. Jove thought I was insane, that approaching any authority figure on the ship was suicide. But I had to try, had to believe that perhaps she was not complicit, that perhaps the ecclesiarchy representative aboard ship was ignorant of what was happening in the sealed cargo bays, that her faith was genuine even if misguided. I was wrong. I found her after morning prayers, as she was returning to whatever quarters the priests occupied on the upper decks. I approached carefully, maintaining the posture of a humble pilgrim seeking guidance, keeping my eyes downcast in appropriate deference. "Sister Carmilla," I said quietly, "might I speak with you on a matter of concern?" She stopped and regarded me with her cold, evaluating gaze. "Speak quickly. My time is valuable. I have noticed irregularities, pilgrims disappearing without explanation. The Harkon family's daughter, for example. They have received no word of her condition despite repeated inquiries. The child is receiving appropriate care, Sister Carmilla replied, her tone suggesting the conversation was already over. As are all pilgrims who require special attention. Your concern is noted, but unnecessary. Sister, I am a former guardsman. I have experience with logistics, with tracking personnel, with noticing patterns. The rate of disappearances is increasing. The explanations provided do not account for all cases. I believe something improper may be occurring without your knowledge. Her expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. A hardness that had always been present intensified into something actively dangerous. Guardsman, she said, investing the word with contempt. You believe your military experience grants you insight into the sacred operation of an ecclesiarchy pilgrimage. You presume to question the management of this vessel based on your limited observations? I question nothing, I said carefully, sensing I had miscalculated badly. I merely wish to ensure that all pilgrims are being treated in accordance with imperial law and the Emperor's will. The Emperor's will, Sister Carmilla said slowly, is manifest through those who serve him faithfully. This ship is operated under the authority of the ecclesiarchy and Chartist Captain Voke, both of whom have rights and responsibilities you cannot begin to comprehend. What happens aboard this vessel serves a purpose far greater than your narrow understanding can encompass. Then help me understand, I pressed, desperate now to gauge how much she knew. Help me see how children disappearing serves the Emperor's purpose. Her hand moved faster than I expected, the power maul she always carried snapping up to press against my throat. The energy field crackled against my skin, not enough to seriously injure, but enough to hurt, to warn, to demonstrate her willingness to do worse. You will cease these inquiries, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. You will return to your prayers and your work details, and your proper place as a penitent seeking redemption. You will speak of these concerns to no one. If you persist in questioning the operation of this sacred vessel, if you spread discord among the faithful, you will be identified as a heretic and dealt with accordingly. She released the pressure on my throat and stepped back, her expression returning to its normal, severe neutrality. The Emperor's work requires sacrifice. Guardsmen. Some sacrifices are obvious, the soldier who dies in battle, the saint who gives her life to protect the faithful. Other sacrifices are more subtle, more complex, beyond the understanding of those not called to make the difficult choices that ensure the Imperium's survival. Question not the methods of those who serve at levels you cannot comprehend. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the corridor with a burning throat and the absolute certainty that she knew. She knew everything that was happening, and she approved. The ecclesiarchy presence on this ship was not ignorant of the harvesting operation. They were complicit, participants. Perhaps they justified it as necessary evil, as the kind of difficult compromise that running a galaxy-spanning Imperium sometimes required. Or perhaps they simply profited from it, accepting bribes or a percentage of the revenue in exchange for their silence and cooperation. I returned to the dormitory in a daze. Jove took one look at my face and understood immediately that the confrontation had not gone well. They're all in on it, I said quietly. Crew, captain, ecclesiarchy. Everyone with authority on this ship knows what's happening and allows it to continue. Then we're on our own, Jove replied. Just us, and whatever pilgrims we can convince to help, against a ship full of crew, guards, and priests who'll kill anyone who threatens their operation. I nodded slowly, the full weight of our situation settling over me. We were not going to be rescued. No authority figure would intervene on our behalf. If we were going to stop this, if we were going to save ourselves and the remaining pilgrims, we would have to do it ourselves. That night, I lay in my bunk and thought about the men I had abandoned on Hadrian's Vale. I had sought this pilgrimage to find redemption for my cowardice, to earn forgiveness for hiding while my brothers died. Instead, I had found a different test, a different battle that demanded I stand and fight despite impossible odds. Perhaps the Emperor had a sense of irony after all. The turning point came 3 days after my confrontation with Sister Carmilla, though it arrived not through careful planning but through desperation born of inevitability. Brother Sebastian was found dead in his bunk. The official explanation, delivered by a crew member during morning assembly, was suicide. The old man had apparently used strips torn from his blanket to hang himself from the support beam of his bunk during the night. A tragedy, we were told, but not uncommon among pilgrims who lost faith during the long journey through the warp. We were encouraged to pray for his soul and to strengthen our own resolve through increased devotion. I did not believe it for a moment. I had spoken with Brother Sebastian just 2 days prior during a brief moment of relative privacy. He had seemed agitated, more willing to speak plainly than in our previous cryptic exchanges. He told me he had made this pilgrimage 4 times over the past 20 years. 4 times. Each journey he survived by being unremarkable, by blending into the masses, by never drawing attention or asking questions. But this time was different, he said. This time the harvest was more aggressive, the disappearances more frequent. He feared his luck had finally run out. They remember repeat passengers, he had whispered. Eventually, they realize you know too much, that you might warn others. That's when they decide you're more valuable processed than whole. I asked him why he kept making these voyages if he knew the danger. His answer chilled me. Because Ophelia Seven is real. The shrine is real. And 4 times I have reached it, knelt before Saint Aspira, and received a blessing that sustained me for years. The journey is horror, but the destination is worth the cost. Or at least, I believed it was. Now I am not certain anything is worth this price. He had been planning to tell me more, to share details from his previous voyages that might help us understand the full scope of the operation. But before we could arrange another meeting, he was dead. I examined his body when they brought it through the dormitory for the traditional viewing before disposal. The marks on his neck were wrong. I had seen death by hanging during my guard service. It created specific patterns of bruising, specific trauma to the throat and cervical vertebrae. Brother Sebastian's injuries were inconsistent with self-hanging. They looked more like strangulation by ligature wielded by another person, murder dressed up as suicide. Jove saw it too when I pointed it out quietly. They killed him because he knew too much and was getting ready to talk, he said. Which means they're watching us more closely than we realized. They know we're asking questions. The paranoia that followed was exhausting. Every crew member became a potential informant. Every pilgrim who showed interest in our conversations became a possible plant sent to monitor us. We could not speak freely anywhere, could not trust anyone we had not carefully vetted. The isolation was deliberate, I realized. By making us afraid to trust others, they prevented any organized resistance from forming. But desperation makes people reckless. And we were running out of time. Jove had continued his explorations during work details, and what he found painted an even grimmer picture than my initial discovery. The sealed cargo bay I had infiltrated was not unique. There were at least 3 other similar facilities scattered throughout the ship's mid-decks, each presumably conducting the same harvesting operations. The scale suggested they were processing not just 7 people per week from Penitent class, but potentially dozens across all pilgrim classes. They're more selective with standard and high pilgrims, Jove explained during one of our carefully orchestrated conversations in the waste reclamation facility where we both now worked. We had requested reassignment there specifically because it was loud, isolated, and generally avoided by crew who did not want to smell like sewage. Those passengers have families with resources, connections that might ask questions. But even there, people are disappearing. The solitary, the sick, those traveling alone. Anyone without a support structure to raise alarms. I had also made a discovery during my own explorations, one that Jove's information helped me interpret. I had found a manifest, poorly secured in a cargo supervisor's office. I accessed during a work detail. It listed the Penitent Star's cargo and passenger count at departure. According to official records, the ship had loaded 12,000 pilgrims total across all classes, plus approximately 800 crew members and ecclesiarchy personnel. I had been tracking the population in Penitent class as best I could. We had started with roughly 3,000. After 3 months, we were down to perhaps 2,600. 400 people gone from just our section alone. If the ratio held across the entire ship, and Jove's observations suggested it might, then potentially 1,600 pilgrims had disappeared over 3 months. 1,600 people harvested for organs, converted into servitors, rendered down into biological components, for sale on black markets across the sector. The numbers were staggering. The profit margins must be enormous. A single set of viable organs could sell for enough to support a lower-class family for years. Multiply that by hundreds of victims per voyage, multiply that by multiple voyages per year, and you had an operation generating wealth that rivaled some planetary economies. No wonder they went to such lengths to maintain it. But the numbers also suggested something else, something that gave me a desperate kind of hope. If they were harvesting 1,600 pilgrims over the course of a journey, that still left over 10,000 alive. 10,000 potential allies. If we could find a way to reach them, to convince them, to organize them into something that could resist. The question was how. The answer came from an unexpected source, Davin Harkin. Melia Harkin had died 4 days after Brother Sebastian. She simply stopped functioning, stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped responding to any external stimuli. Her body remained alive, but her mind had retreated to some interior space where the horror of her daughter's loss could not reach her. Eventually, her body gave out, and the crew disposed of her corpse without ceremony or explanation. Davin found her gone one morning. When he returned from work detail, her bunk already stripped and reassigned. I expected him to break completely. Instead, something inside him crystallized into something harder and colder than despair. He became focused with the intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose. No reason to be careful. No future worth preserving. He was dangerous in the way that truly broken people are dangerous, unpredictable, willing to sacrifice anything, including himself, for even the smallest chance at revenge. He approached Jove and me directly, abandoning any pretense of subtlety. "I know you're investigating what happened to the missing pilgrims," he said without preamble. "I know you found something in the sealed areas. I want in. Whatever you're planning, whatever you need, I'm with you." Jove looked at me, uncertainty written across his face. Davin was unstable, compromised by grief. Exactly the kind of recruit who could get us all killed through rash action. But he was also motivated, fearless, and skilled. I had seen him work, seen the way his manufactorum training translated to mechanical aptitude and practical problem-solving. "What makes you think we're planning anything?" I asked, carefully. "Because you're not dead yet," Davin replied. "Because you ask questions and notice patterns, and you're still alive, which means you're being careful. But careful only works for so long. Eventually, you have to act. And when you do, you'll need people willing to fight. I'm volunteering. I made a decision that would determine everything that followed." "All right," I said. "But you follow our lead. No independent action. No revenge missions that compromise operational security. We do this smart, or we don't do it at all. Agreed?" "Agreed," Davin said, and I chose to believe him despite my reservations. With Davin recruited, we began more aggressive intelligence gathering. He had skills Jove and I lacked. He could read technical schematics, understand mechanical systems, identify potential vulnerabilities in the ship's infrastructure. During his work details in maintenance, he began mapping the ship's layout in detail, noting power junctions, critical systems, potential choke points we could exploit. We also began carefully recruiting others. It was agonizingly slow work, requiring weeks of observation to identify candidates who seemed both trustworthy and capable. We looked for pilgrims who had the right combination of traits: observant enough to have noticed the disappearances, skeptical enough to question official explanations, stable enough to be trusted with dangerous knowledge, and desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at survival or justice. Our first recruit, beyond Davin, was a woman named Kira, a former enforcer from a hive world who had resigned her position and undertaken the pilgrimage after her entire precinct house was killed in a criminal uprising. She had escaped only through luck and absence. She had combat training, tactical thinking, and most importantly, a healthy distrust of authority, born from seeing how thoroughly corruption could infiltrate institutions that should be incorruptible. Next was Markle, a tech worker who had served on merchant vessels before some incident he would not discuss fully had led to his discharge and subsequent pilgrimage. He understood ships, understood systems, and confirmed what Davin had suspected about potential vulnerabilities in the Penitent Star's infrastructure. We found others over the following weeks, careful additions to our conspiracy, each one vetted through multiple conversations, each one tested with gradually escalating information to ensure they would not betray us to the crew or Sister Carmilla. By the time we reached month 4 of the journey, we had assembled a core group of 23 pilgrims who knew the truth about the ship and were prepared to act. 23 people against a crew of 800, against guards who were armed and trained, against a ship's infrastructure designed to contain and control us. The odds were absurd, but doing nothing meant slow death as we were harvested one by one, processed like livestock until none remained. We needed a plan. More than that, we needed proof. Something undeniable that would convince the remaining pilgrims to join us when the moment came. My testimony alone, even supported by the others in our group, would not be enough. We needed evidence so graphic, so irrefutable, that it would shatter the faith that kept most pilgrims docile. Joe volunteered to obtain it. "I can get into the sealed cargo bay," he said during one of our planning meetings, held in a maintenance tunnel we had found that was rarely patrolled. "I've been mapping the guard rotations, the shift changes, the moments when security is lightest. There's a window during third shift when only one guard is posted at the main entrance. I can slip past, get inside, and use a picked recorder to document what's happening there." "Too dangerous," I argued. "If you're caught, they'll kill you, and we'll lose our best scout. If we don't get proof, we'll never convince enough pilgrims to make resistance viable," Jove countered. "Right now, it's our word against the ecclesiarchy. We need images, video footage that can't be explained away or dismissed as delusion." He was right, though I hated admitting it. "Then I'm coming with you," I said. "2 sets of eyes, 2 people to watch for patrols, better chance of success." We planned the infiltration for 3 days hence. During the third shift, when pilgrim populations were locked in dormitories and crew presence was at its lightest, Markle provided us with a picked recorder he had stolen from a cargo supervisor during a work detail, a small device capable of capturing both still images and video. Kira coached us on approach techniques and extraction routes, drawing on her enforcer training to identify the safest paths. The night of the infiltration, I could not sleep during the hours before we were supposed to move. I lay in my bunk listening to the sounds of 3,000 pilgrims breathing, coughing, shifting in their sleep. How many of them would still be alive by journey's end? How many would disappear into those surgical bays to be rendered down into component parts? If we succeeded tonight, if we could expose the truth and organize resistance, perhaps we could save some of them. Perhaps. At 0200 hours, Jove and I slipped from our bunks and made our way through the dormitory as quietly as possible. We had both wrapped our feet in strips of fabric to muffle footsteps, and we moved with the practiced silence of people who understood that detection meant death. The route to the utility corridors required passing 2 crew checkpoints, but at this hour they were minimally staffed, and the crew members on duty were typically half asleep themselves, more interested in counting down the hours until shift change than in watching for wandering pilgrims. We made it past both checkpoints without incident, entering the maintenance tunnels that would carry us to Deck 42. The ship at night, or what passed for night in a vessel that operated on artificial cycles, felt different. The constant background noise of thousands of people was absent, replaced by the sounds of the ship itself. Machinery humming, pipes creaking, the distant rumble of the warp drives that pushed us through the Imperium toward whatever destination we were actually heading. The climb to Deck 42 took 40 minutes of careful navigation through access shafts and maintenance passages. We encountered 1 patrol, 2 crew members moving through a corridor we needed to cross and had to wait in a cramped junction for 15 minutes until they passed. Every moment felt like an eternity. Every sound amplified by adrenaline and fear. When we finally reached the sealed cargo bay, we found conditions exactly as Jove had predicted. 1 guard at the main entrance, looking bored and inattentive, his posture suggesting he expected no trouble during this shift. The ventilation access I had used during my first infiltration was still unsecured. Apparently no one had noticed my previous entry. We entered the ductwork and crawled toward the cargo bay, Jove behind me, both of us moving with agonizing slowness to avoid making noise that might alert the guard or anyone inside. When we reached the ventilation grate that overlooked the bay, I carefully positioned myself to peer through while Jove prepared the pict recorder, adjusting its settings to account for the low light and distance. The bay was active, despite the late hour. Perhaps 8 chirurgeons worked at various stations, processing bodies on the surgical tables. I recognized several of the victims, pilgrims from standard class, whom I had seen during the rare occasions when different passenger groups mixed in common areas. They were being harvested with the same efficient brutality I had witnessed during my first observation. Magos Hex was present, supervising the operations while simultaneously conducting his own experiments at a specialized station. He had a living subject impossible to tell if male or female after the extensive modifications already performed, strapped to an examination table. The subject's chest cavity was open, organs replaced with mechanical components that pulsed and whirred with unnatural life. The victim was conscious, their mouth open in a scream that produced no sound. Magos Hex had removed their vocal cords, I realized. They were aware of what was being done to them, but unable to vocalize their suffering. Jove captured it all. The pict recorder's memory storage filled with images and video footage that documented every horror. The harvesting operations, the servitor conversions, the experimental modifications, the storage tanks filled with preserved organs, the disposal chutes where unusable biomass was discarded. He focused particularly on faces, both victims and perpetrators, ensuring we could identify everyone involved. We documented for 20 minutes, capturing more than enough evidence to prove our claims. Then Jove tapped my shoulder, signaling it was time to withdraw. We had what we needed. Staying longer only increased the risk of discovery. The retreat through the ventilation ducts was even more nerve-wracking than the approach. We both knew that if we were discovered now, the evidence we carried would die with us. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement felt too loud, every moment stretched into eternity. We were halfway through the utility corridors when disaster struck. A crew patrol appeared without warning, emerging from a junction ahead of us. 3 crew members, armed with shock mauls and vox beads, connecting them to ship security. They saw us immediately, 2 pilgrims where no pilgrims should be, during a shift when all pilgrims should be locked in dormitories. "Halt!" one of them shouted, reaching for the vox bead to call for reinforcements. Jove moved faster than I thought possible. He closed the distance to the crew member in seconds, his underhive combat instincts taking over. The fight was brief and brutal. Jove's hands found the crew member's throat before the man could speak into his vox, squeezing, cutting off air and voice. The other 2 crew members swung their shock mauls, but Jove twisted, using the first crew member as a shield. One of the mauls connected with their comrade instead, the electrical charge causing him to convulse. I engaged the remaining 2 crew members, my guard combat training coming back despite years of disuse. A shock maul swung toward my head. I blocked with my forearm, accepting the painful impact rather than the potentially lethal head strike. My other hand shot forward, fingers extended, catching the crew member in the throat. He gagged, stumbling backward, and I followed up with a knee to his groin that dropped him. The 3rd crew member tried to run, to escape and raise the alarm. Jove caught him from behind, one arm wrapping around the man's throat in a chokehold that cut off blood flow to the brain. The crew member struggled for perhaps 10 seconds before going limp. We stood in the corridor, breathing hard, looking down at 3 unconscious or dead crew members. We had just crossed a line we could not uncross. We had attacked the ship's personnel, committed violence against those in authority. There would be no forgiveness for this, no possibility of claiming misunderstanding or accident. "We have to hide the bodies," Jove said, already thinking tactically despite the adrenaline flooding both our systems. "Buy time before they're reported missing." We dragged the crew members into a maintenance closet, stuffed them behind spare equipment where they would not be immediately visible. It would not fool a thorough search, but it might grant us hours before the alarm was raised. Hours we desperately needed. The return to Penitent class was the longest journey of my life. Every shadow could conceal a patrol. Every sound could be the alarm being raised. But we made it back to the dormitory just as the 0500 klaxon began its morning scream, slipping into our bunks moments before the lights came up and the daily routine resumed. I lay there, heart pounding, the picked recorder hidden beneath my mattress, and realized we were committed now. We had the evidence. We had crossed the Rubicon by attacking crew members. There was no going back, no possibility of quietly surviving until we reached Ophelia 7. We would have to fight. And soon, over the next 2 days, we moved carefully to prepare for what had to come next. The crew members we had attacked were discovered on schedule, their bodies found in the maintenance closet during routine inspections. The ship went on high alert immediately. Additional patrols were deployed, security checkpoints were reinforced, and all pilgrims were confined to their assigned areas, except during mandatory prayer sessions and work details. Sister Carmilla addressed penitent class during evening prayers, her voice carrying barely restrained fury. "There has been an incident of violence against the ship's crew," she announced. 3 faithful servants of the Emperor were attacked by unknown assailants, 2 murdered and 1 left critically injured. This blasphemy will not be tolerated. All pilgrims are hereby restricted to essential movements, only until the perpetrators are identified and punished. The increased security made our movements more difficult, but it also created opportunity. The crew was looking for attackers, not for conspirators preparing a larger action. They were focused on identifying individuals rather than detecting organized resistance. This blindness, born of underestimating the desperate masses they exploited, would be their undoing. We gathered our core group in small numbers, never more than 3 or 4 at a time, during work details and prayer sessions. We passed the picked recorder between us, ensuring everyone saw the evidence we had captured. The images were undeniable. Even the most faithful among us could not explain away video footage of pilgrims being harvested for organs while still alive, of children's bodies floating in preservation tanks, of Magos Hex casually discussing specimen viability, while dissecting a conscious victim. The evidence shattered the last vestiges of faith that had kept many docile. Anger replaced despair. The desire for survival replaced the passive acceptance of suffering as purification. One by one, pilgrims who had been content to endure now became willing to resist. But we remained only 23 confirmed fighters out of 2,600 pilgrims in penitent class alone. We needed more. We needed the masses to rise with us, or our resistance would be crushed before it truly began. The solution came from an unexpected ally. One of our conspirators, a woman named Thessa, who had previously worked as a Vox operator on her homeworld, realized she could access the ship's internal communication system during her work detail in the communications nexus. She could not broadcast freely without being detected immediately, but she could prepare a message for broadcast that would reach every section of the ship simultaneously. One message, delivered at the right moment, containing the evidence we had gathered and a call to action. "When do we broadcast?" she asked during one of our hurried planning sessions. I looked to Jove, to Davin, to Kira and Markle, and the others who had risked everything to reach this point. I said, "Very soon, because we're running out of time and out of options." The ship's chronometer indicated we had been in the warp for 4 months and 22 days. According to Captain Vok's last announcement, we were still making steady progress toward Ophelia 7, with arrival estimated when the Emperor wills it. But Markle, using his technical knowledge and observations of the ship's systems, believed we had been traveling in a repeating pattern, looping through sections of the warp rather than making linear progress toward any destination. The Penitent Star was not a pilgrimage ship at all. It was a floating abattoir, traveling indefinitely through the warp, harvesting its passengers for as long as the supplies lasted and the operation remained profitable. We were never going to reach Ophelia 7. This ship would travel until every pilgrim aboard had been processed. Then it would return to some Imperial port to load another batch of desperate faithful for the next cycle. We were caught in a nightmare that would continue until we stopped it ourselves. "We move at the end of the week," I told the group. "Thessa broadcasts the evidence during evening prayers when everyone is gathered. The shock of seeing the truth will break their conditioning. Then we seize weapons from the armory on Deck 39, fortify Penitent class, and demand the ship's surrender." "They'll never surrender," Kira said. "Too much money involved. Too many people complicit. They'll try to kill us all rather than let us expose them." "I know," I replied. "Which means we'll have to fight our way to the bridge and take control of the ship by force. It's the only way any of us survive." The plan was desperate, built on hope and rage rather than solid tactical foundation. But it was all we had. 23 conspirators preparing to lead a revolt of desperate pilgrims against a crew that had been harvesting human beings for profit. We would almost certainly fail. Most of us would probably die. But failure while fighting was better than the alternative. As I lay in my bunk that night, staring at the corroded metal ceiling of the dormitory, I thought about the men I had abandoned on Hadrian's Vale. I had carried their deaths with me across years and light years, seeking redemption through pilgrimage, hoping the Emperor would forgive my cowardice. Instead, the Emperor, or fate, or random chance, had given me a different opportunity. Not redemption through prayer and penance, but through action. Through standing and fighting when everything rational said to hide and survive. Perhaps this was what I had needed all along. Not forgiveness for past cowardice, but the chance to prove it would not be repeated. In 3 days, we would either be dead or free. I prayed then, for the first time in weeks, but not for forgiveness or salvation. I prayed for strength, for courage, for the will to see this through, regardless of cost. And I prayed that, if we failed, someone would survive to tell the Imperium what happened aboard the Penitent Star. That our deaths would at least serve as warning to others who might board such ships in hope of salvation. The Emperor protects, they say. But sometimes, I was learning, we have to protect ourselves. The 3 days before our planned uprising passed with agonizing slowness. Each hour waited with the knowledge of what was coming. We moved through the daily routines, prayers, work details, meals like actors performing familiar roles, while our minds raced with preparations for the violence ahead. Our conspiracy had grown. 23 had become 47. Word spread through careful whispers, passed during the brief moments of proximity that work details and prayer sessions allowed. We showed the picked recorder evidence only to those we trusted absolutely, those who had already begun questioning, already noticed the disappearances, already carried enough anger to be useful when the moment came. Not everyone who learned the truth joined us. Some pilgrims, confronted with undeniable evidence of the harvesting operations, simply broke. Their faith was so fundamental to their identity that its betrayal destroyed something essential in their minds. They retreated into catatonia or hysterical denial, and we had to carefully monitor them to ensure they did not reveal our plans through incoherent rambling. Others refused to believe despite the evidence. They watched the footage of surgical tables and organ harvesting and found ways to rationalize it. Perhaps those were criminals being justly punished. Perhaps the emperor required such sacrifices for the greater good. Perhaps our images were false, fabricated by heretics to undermine faith. The human capacity for self-deception, I learned, was limitless when the alternative was confronting an unbearable truth. But for every pilgrim who broke or denied, 2 more joined our cause. Veterans like myself who recognized the tactical necessities of survival. Parents who had lost children to the disappearances. Workers who understood exploitation when they saw it. The desperate who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from fighting back. By the evening of our planned uprising, we numbered approximately 200 willing fighters from Penitent class alone. 200 against 800 crew members and an unknown number of armed guards. The odds remained terrible, but they were better than they had been. Our plan was necessarily simple, because complexity would have required coordination we could not achieve without alerting the crew. The uprising would occur during evening prayers at 2000 hours, when all of Penitent class would be gathered in the assembly halls and could be addressed simultaneously. Thessa would broadcast the evidence through the ship's internal Vox system, ensuring every section of the vessel saw what we had discovered. The shock and rage from pilgrims across all classes would create chaos that we could exploit. In that chaos, our fighters would seize weapons from the nearest armory on deck 39. Markel had identified it during his work details, a relatively small facility containing lasguns, shock mauls, and basic combat equipment used by ship security. It was guarded, but lightly. And once we had weapons, we could arm enough pilgrims to make ourselves a genuine threat rather than just an angry mob. From there, we would fortify Penitent class, using the narrow corridors and choke points to our advantage. We would hold our territory and demand the ship's surrender, threatening to damage critical systems if they attempted to flush us out with superior force. And if surrender proved impossible, which seemed likely, we would fight our way to the bridge deck by deck, corridor by corridor, until we either controlled the ship or died trying. It was not a good plan. But it was the only plan available to people with no weapons, no authority, and no option except resistance or death. The day of the uprising began like any other. The 500 klaxons screamed us awake. We stumbled to the communal facilities, relieved ourselves shoulder to shoulder with strangers, shuffled to the feeding halls for our corpse starch rations. Morning prayers lasted the usual 8 hours, Sister Carmilla's voice droning through familiar liturgies while I mentally rehearsed the coming violence. During work detail that afternoon, I was assigned to cargo maintenance with Jove and Davin. We worked in silence, moving containers and equipment under the board supervision of a crew member who was more interested in his data slate than in monitoring our labor. The normal routine, performed by people who were hours away from attempting something that would either free us or get us killed. "You ready?" Jove whispered during a moment when the supervisor was distracted. No, I replied honestly. But that's never stopped anyone from doing what needs to be done. Davin said nothing, but his hands clenched and unclenched constantly, betraying the nervous energy that filled him. He had been like this for days now, wound tight as a spring, waiting for the moment he could strike back against those who had taken his wife and daughter. I worried about him, worried he would act rashly and compromise everything. But I also recognized that his rage might be useful in the violence ahead. Sometimes controlled fury was more effective than cold calculation. The afternoon work detail ended. We returned to Penitent class for the evening meal. Another corpse starch block, another cup of recycled water. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing. My mind focused entirely on the hours ahead. Around me, other conspirators did the same, their faces carefully neutral, betraying nothing to the crew members who watched us with casual contempt. 2000 hours approached. The klaxon sounded, summoning us to evening prayers. 3,000 pilgrims rose from their bunks and workstations, filing through corridors toward the assembly halls. I moved with them, just another body in the crowd, indistinguishable from the masses. But my heart hammered in my chest, and my hands trembled slightly with adrenaline beginning to flood my system. We entered Assembly Hall 7, the massive chamber where Penitent class conducted our mandatory devotions. The space could hold perhaps 1,500 people, and it was packed to capacity. Pilgrims pressed together in tight rows, while Sister Carmilla and 2 other ecclesiarchy priests took their positions on the raised platform at the front. Armed guards stood at the exits, 4 in total, armed with shock mauls and las guns, their posture suggesting they expected no trouble from the docile masses they oversaw. They were about to be very surprised. Sister Carmilla began the evening prayers at precisely 2000 hours, her voice amplified through the hall's vox system. We gather in the Emperor's name to offer our devotion and renew our commitment to the sacred journey that will deliver us to salvation on Ophelia 7. I tuned out her words, focusing instead on the positions of the guards, the layout of the hall, the nearest exits. Around me, other conspirators did the same, recognizing each other through subtle signals. We had arranged a particular way of standing, a hand positioned just so, markers that identified us to each other without alerting the crew. Sister Carmilla droned on for 15 minutes, leading us through familiar prayers and hymns. Then, at exactly 2015 hours, Thessa, positioned in the communications nexus 3 decks above us, activated the broadcast. The vox speakers throughout the ship crackled with static, interrupting Sister Carmilla mid-sentence. Her face contorted with anger at the technical interruption, and she gestured sharply to one of the guards, presumably ordering him to investigate the malfunction. Then the images began. Every vox screen in the ship, every display panel, every surface capable of projecting images suddenly showed the footage we had captured. The surgical tables, the organ harvesting, the servitor conversions, children's bodies in preservation tanks, Magos Hex calmly discussing harvest rates while dissecting a living subject. 20 minutes of undeniable evidence, broadcast simultaneously to every section of the Penitent Star, seen by every pilgrim and every crew member aboard. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. In Assembly Hall 7, the initial response was shocked silence. 3,000 pilgrims stood frozen, staring at the vox screens, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. This could not be real. This could not be happening aboard a sacred pilgrimage vessel. The ecclesiarchy would not permit such horrors. The Emperor would not allow his faithful to be butchered like livestock. But the evidence was undeniable. Frame after frame of documentation showing exactly that. The pilgrimage was a lie. The ship was a slaughterhouse. Everyone aboard was either complicit in mass murder or marked for eventual harvesting. The silence shattered into chaos. Someone screamed. Then another. Then dozens. Hundreds. the sound building into a wave of collective horror and rage that filled the hall like a physical force. Pilgrims surged toward the exits, toward the guards, toward Sister Carmilla and the other priests on the platform. There was no coordination, no plan. Just raw panic and fury erupting from people who had been pushed beyond their capacity to endure. The guards at the exits raised their shock mauls, trying to restore order through threat of violence. One of them fired his lasgun into the air, the crack of superheated energy momentarily cutting through the chaos. "Remain calm," he shouted, his voice amplified through a portable vox. "Return to your positions or face summary punishment." No one listened. The mob pressed forward, overwhelming through sheer numbers. I saw the guard who had fired disappear beneath a wave of bodies, his screams cut short as dozens of pilgrims tore him apart with their bare hands. The other guards tried to retreat, to reach the exits and seal the hall, but they were too slow. The crowd caught them, dragged them down, beat them to death with improvised weapons and raw fury. Sister Carmilla stood on the platform, her power maul crackling with energy, her face twisted into an expression of righteous anger. "Heretics!" she screamed. "This is false witness. Lies spread by those who would turn you from the Emperor's path. Resist this heresy, or be damned." Her words might have worked on these pilgrims 3 months ago, when faith was still intact and authority still commanded reflexive obedience. But that faith had been shattered by the images still playing on every screen. Her authority meant nothing to people who had seen the truth of what awaited them. The crowd surged toward the platform. Sister Carmilla struck the first pilgrim to reach her, her power maul connecting with his skull and caving it in instantly. She struck again and again, each blow killing or crippling. The crowd overwhelmed her through sheer weight of numbers, pulling her down, her power maul torn from her hands, her screams adding to the cacophony as they beat her to death. I did not participate in the killing. I had no love for Sister Carmilla, no pity for her fate, but I had a mission that required me to remain focused rather than expending energy on revenge. I pushed through the chaos toward the hall's secondary exit, calling out to those conspirators near enough to hear. "To the armory. Follow me." Perhaps 30 pilgrims heard and responded, breaking away from the mob to follow me through the exit and into the corridors beyond. Among them were Jove, Davin, Kira, and Markel, our core leadership, along with others whose names I knew and some I did not. We ran through corridors that were themselves filling with chaos as news of the broadcast spread and pilgrims across all sections of the ship began to riot. We encountered our first serious resistance halfway to the armory. A squad of ship security, 8 guards in flak armor, armed with lasguns and shock mauls, organized and moving with tactical discipline, blocked the corridor ahead. They had erected a hasty barricade using cargo containers and were using it as cover while they fired into the crowds of rioting pilgrims. "Fall back," their sergeant shouted. "Seal this section. Don't let them reach the upper decks." We had no weapons, no armor, nothing but numbers and desperation. Charging that position would be suicide. Most of us would die before we reached the barricade, cut down by lasgun fire that we had no way to counter. Markel grabbed my arm. "The ventilation system," he said urgently. "There's an access point 20 meters back. We can flank them through the maintenance passages." I nodded and relayed the plan to the others. While the main group created a distraction, shouting, throwing improvised projectiles, drawing the guards' attention, Markel, Jove, Davin, Kira, and I slipped into the ventilation access and began working our way through the cramped passages toward a position behind the guards' barricade. The crawl through the ducts felt interminable, my body pressed against cold metal. The sounds of lasgun fire and screaming filtering through the vents from the corridor beyond. But we emerged where Markel had predicted, in a maintenance alcove behind the security squad's position. We attacked from behind, without warning or mercy. I took the sergeant, my hands closing around his throat before he could shout a warning. Jove and Davin engaged 2 more guards, their underhive combat skills lethal in close quarters. Kira used a length of pipe she had torn from the ventilation system as an improvised club, swinging it with the precision of someone trained in melee combat. The fight lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When it ended, 8 guards lay dead or dying, and we had secured 8 lasguns, 8 sets of flak armor, and enough ammunition to arm a proper fighting force. "Strip the bodies," I ordered. "Take everything useful. Weapons, armor, vox beads, anything we can use." We worked quickly, divesting the corpses of their equipment while the sounds of riot continued to echo through the corridors. Other pilgrims, seeing what we had done, began to rally to our position. Within minutes, we had grown from 5 fighters to nearly 50, and more were arriving constantly as word spread that we had weapons and were organizing resistance. The armory on deck 39 was now within reach. We advanced in a formation that was more mob than military unit. But we were armed now, capable of fighting back rather than just dying. The corridors we passed through showed evidence of the spreading chaos bodies. Blood, damage to ship systems where fighting had damaged critical equipment. The Penitent Star was tearing itself apart. We reached the armory to find it already under siege by another group of pilgrims from standard class. They had apparently reached the same conclusion we had about the need for weapons but lacked the tactical knowledge to breach the armory's reinforced door. The guards inside had sealed themselves in and were firing through vision slits at anyone who approached, killing dozens of pilgrims who charged the position with suicidal bravery and no plan. "Fall back," I shouted to the standard class pilgrims. "Let us through." Some listened. Others were too consumed by rage or panic to register the order and continued their futile assault. I felt a moment of frustrated anger at the waste these people were dying for nothing, throwing themselves at a fortified position they could not possibly take through frontal assault. Markle studied the armory's entrance for perhaps 30 seconds, then pointed to a junction box mounted on the adjacent wall. "Power supply for the door's locking mechanism," he said. "If we can short it out, the door will lose power and default to manual unlocking." "How long?" I asked. 5 minutes if I'm not interrupted. Less if someone who actually knows electrical systems helps me. "Do it. Everyone else, provide covering fire. Keep those guards' heads down so they can't target Markle." We established a firing line, pilgrims with las guns shooting at the armory's vision slits whenever a guard tried to aim through them. The fire was inaccurate. Most of these people had never held weapons before, but volume compensated for precision. The guards were forced to keep their heads down, unable to effectively engage us while Markle worked on the junction box. True to his estimate, 5 minutes later the armory door's locking mechanism failed with a loud clunk. The door remained closed, but was no longer sealed. Jove and I, wearing the flak armor we had taken from the dead guards, approached the door while others provided covering fire. We forced it open manually, and I threw in a smoke grenade we had taken from one of the guards, a desperate gambit, since I had no idea if pilgrims would follow us into smoke or if they would balk. They followed. We poured into the armory through the smoke, overwhelming the 4 guards inside through sheer numbers before they could mount an effective defense. The fight was brutal and quick. When it ended, we controlled an armory containing perhaps 200 lasguns, 50 shock mauls, 30 sets of flak armor, and enough ammunition to sustain a protracted engagement. "Arm everyone who can fight," I shouted over the chaos. "Prioritize those with military or security experience. Everyone else falls back to penitent class and helps establish defensive positions." For the first time since the uprising began, I felt a flicker of hope. We were armed now, organized, capable of defending ourselves against anything except overwhelming force. If we could hold our territory, if we could maintain cohesion, we might actually survive this. That hope lasted approximately 10 minutes. The ship's internal vox system crackled to life, cutting through the chaos with a voice I had heard many times but never seen in person. "Captain Erasmus Voke, "Attention all personnel and passengers," he said, his cultured accent somehow more obscene given the circumstances. "The recent unpleasantness is regrettable, but not unexpected. It seems some of you have discovered certain operational aspects of this vessel that were not intended for general knowledge. Allow me to clarify the situation." He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he continued. "The Penitent Star is indeed a harvesting operation. It has been for nearly 30 years, across dozens of successful voyages. You pilgrims are cargo, nothing more. Your organs, your biological materials, your potential conversion into servitors, these represent significant commercial value that more than justifies the cost of maintaining this operation." Another pause. Then, "However, I acknowledge that your recent discovery has complicated matters. You have damaged ship property, killed crew members, and disrupted carefully maintained schedules. This cannot be tolerated. Therefore, I am implementing emergency protocols. All sections occupied by rioting pilgrims will be sealed and flooded with toxic gas within the next 15 minutes. Those who surrender immediately and return to designated holding areas will be processed quickly and humanely. Those who resist will die slowly and painfully." The Vox clicked off, leaving his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Markle's face went pale. "He's not bluffing," he said quietly. "This ship has internal atmospheric control systems capable of flooding specific sections with toxic compounds. It's standard on large vessels designed to fight fires or purge biological contaminants. He can absolutely do what he's threatening." "Then we need to reach the bridge," I said. "Take control of those systems before he can activate them." "How long do we have?" He said, 15 minutes. "It'll actually take closer to 20 to cycle through the safety protocols and initialize the gas release, but not much longer. 20 minutes to fight our way from Deck 39 to the bridge on Deck 7, through corridors that would be defended by crew members fighting for their lives and their profits, against guards with superior equipment, superior training, and superior positions. It was impossible. We had to try anyway. Everyone capable of fighting. With me, I shouted. We're going to the bridge. Everyone else, evacuate to the upper decks, get out of Penitent class before the gas release. Perhaps 100 pilgrims followed me, the rest scattering to warn others or simply fleeing toward what they hoped would be safety. We ran through corridors that were now filling with toxic smoke, not from Voke's threatened gas release, but from fires started during the riots. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow, and the ship's alarm klaxons added to the chaos with their constant shrieking. We encountered resistance almost immediately. Crew members had established defensive positions at key junctions, using their knowledge of the ship's layout to maximum advantage. We had to fight for every corridor, every intersection, buying passage with blood and ammunition we could not afford to waste. Jove fell during one of these engagements, a lasgun bolt catching him in the chest. His improvised flak armor absorbed most of the impact, but the injury was severe enough to leave him unable to continue. He grabbed my arm as I knelt beside him. "Go," he gasped, blood flecking his lips. "We're not leaving you," I said, though I knew it was a lie even as I spoke it. We could not carry wounded and maintain our advance. Every second of delay gave Voke time to activate his gas systems. Jove knew it too. "Yes, you are," he said. He pulled a grenade from his belt, one of the improvised explosives Davin had constructed from materials stolen during work details. "I'll hold this position. Buy you time. Make it count, Matthias. Make my death mean something." I wanted to argue, to find some alternative, but there was none. So I simply nodded, squeezed his shoulder once, and moved on, leaving him behind to die alone in a smoke-filled corridor while holding off crew members who would show him no mercy. I heard the explosion perhaps 2 minutes later, Jove's final act of defiance, taking as many of them with him as he could. We lost more people with every deck we ascended. Davin died on Deck 22, shot while trying to breach a barricade. Kira made it to Deck 15 before a shock maul caught her in the head, killing her instantly. Others whose names I had learned over the past months, people who had become comrades if not quite friends, fell one by one until our force of 100 had dwindled to perhaps 30. But we were getting closer. Deck 7 was just ahead. Then Magos Hex arrived with his security forces, and everything went to hell. I tell you this from a Medici facility on Vaxen Hive, one of 47 survivors from 12,000 pilgrims. We never reached the bridge. Magos Hex's combat servitors cut us down deck by deck. But our uprising damaged the ship enough to force emergency translation from the warp. An Imperial Navy patrol found us drifting, investigated, and discovered the horror. Captain Voke died before interrogation. Magos Hex escaped. Most crew were executed quietly, their crimes buried in bureaucratic obscurity. The Imperium prefers convenient lies to uncomfortable truths. I tried warning others. The Inquisition listened, conducted raids, disrupted the network temporarily. But it rebuilds, always rebuilds. Too much profit, too little oversight, too many desperate faithful. So I tell you, if you board a pilgrimage ship, understand what you risk. Not all are death traps, but many are. Check the ship's history. Question vague answers. Trust nothing. The Imperium will not protect you. Faith is not a shield, it is a target painted on your back. In the grim darkness of the far future, even salvation has a price, and someone else is always waiting to collect it.